This is a lecture on the book of Deuteronomy, a book that consists of speeches of Moses after the 40 years of wilderness wanderings. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. The English title, Deuteronomy, means a second giving of the law. The Ten Commandments are repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and there are other laws that are similar to the laws of the Book of the Covenant, for example, in the book of Exodus. And so a second giving of a law is a fair description of what this book is about. The Hebrew title is based on the first few words of the book. The book begins with, and these are the words, Ele ha-devarim, and that's shortened to Devarim, words, and Devarim thus becomes the title of the book in the Hebrew Bible. In this case, the Hebrew title is not very descriptive of the content of the book. The setting of Deuteronomy is on the plains of Moab. They have come to the plains of Moab at the end of the book of Numbers, just north of the Dead Sea, perched to enter the land of promise. Chronologically, this follows the 40 years described in the book of Numbers and is continuing the story of Numbers. So in essence, the book consists of speeches of Moses shortly before Moses' death. And the time covered in this book is really only a matter of days. Now let's talk about the authorship of Deuteronomy. Modern conservative scholars will say that Moses wrote Deuteronomy, though they will allow for some subsequent editing. You get that idea from the very first verse. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan. And it indicates that Moses spoke the words that are put in Moses' mouth. Moses did not write the account of his own death, however, Deuteronomy 34, there's no need to assume that. Moreover, his speeches are introduced by a narrator, and that narrator is presumably someone other than Moses himself. This has been argued well by Daniel Block in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society in 2001, if you'd like to learn more about the narrator's role in Deuteronomy. Now, the conservative view is to be starkly contrasted with the view of the Wellhausen school, you might call the liberal view. The Wellhausen school ascribes most of the book to a source that they label D. They follow the view of W.M.L. de Wit, who proposed that Deuteronomy was a pious fraud that put words of the 7th century Jerusalem priests into the mouth of Moses. And they date the book to around 621 BC, at the time that they found an earlier version of Deuteronomy in the temple at the time of Josiah. The purpose of the book, according to the Wellhausen school, was to centralize worship to Jerusalem, the place that the Lord your God chooses, as it puts it in Deuteronomy 12 and verse 5. In other words, they were not to worship in any of the high places. They were only to worship in Jerusalem. Conservatives respond to this liberal view in a variety of ways. The liberal view is theologically unacceptable. It makes Scripture wrong and deceptive. It makes Scripture a pious fraud, which is de Wit's own term. Moreover, the liberal view is exegetically unnecessary. Their interpretation of Deuteronomy 12 and verse 5 is arguably wrong. Deuteronomy does allow for secondary altars and does not centralize worship into Jerusalem, at least not at the time that Deuteronomy was written. For example, in Deuteronomy 16 and verse 21, it says, "Do not set up any Asherah wooden pole besides the altar you build to the Lord your God. That verse, Deuteronomy 16:21, assumes that they're going to build altars to the Lord other than the altar in the tabernacle. And thus, there are other altars. It's not centralizing the worship to just the sanctuary's altar. Likewise, Deuteronomy 27, verses 4 and 5 says this: when you have crossed the Jordan and set up these stones on Mount Ebal, as I command you today, and coat them with plaster, build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not use any iron tool upon them. Here it actually commands Israel to build an altar other than the altar at the sanctuary. The sanctuary altar was made out of bronze. This altar would be made out of stone. It's to follow the rules of building altars of stone, not using any iron tool on them, as commanded in the Book of the Covenant in Exodus chapter 21. And so, again, it assumes that there are more than one altar that's around. In addition, David's 7th century date for Deuteronomy can be challenged, and we'll come back to this point in just a moment. So let's give a more plausible explanation for Deuteronomy chapter 12. David's proposal is essentially a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories make for dramatic fiction, which is why such theories often capture people's imaginations, but they are rarely true in reality. Over time, truth comes out. David assumes that this conspiracy was kept secret until he cleverly discovered it over 2 millennia later in the 1800s. And this is inherently unlikely. J.G. McConville gives a better explanation of Deuteronomy 12 and verse 5. He argues that you're to worship at the place that the Lord your God chooses does not prohibit non-tabernacle altars. What it's trying to do is express the ideal of religious unity. It's emphasizing the true altar, the one at the tabernacle, in contrast with prohibited altars, the Canaanite altars elsewhere. And so the contrast is not many altars versus one, but Canaanite altars versus God's altar. Again, Deuteronomy 16:21 and Deuteronomy 27:5 show that other altars were tolerated even by the Deuteronomists, the author of Deuteronomy, according to the Wellhausen School. Deuteronomy 16:21 refers to building of other altars. Deuteronomy 27:5 commands an altar of stone to be built, which was actually built in Joshua chapter 8. McConville's view is good, but there is an alternative view of Deuteronomy 12 and verse 5, and that is that this verse is predictive of the future. You're only to worship at the place that the Lord your God chooses, and that could refer to the sanctuary altar, but it's a future thing rather than something in Moses' day. In Moses' day, other altars were allowed, but in the distant future, only one altar would be legitimate for sacrifice. It looks like 1 Kings 3 and verse 2 takes this point of view. It says, at that time, at the time of Solomon, the people were still sacrificing at the high places because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. In other words, this command of Deuteronomy 12 and verse 5 could only be applied when they built an altar for the name of the Lord in the sanctuary that ultimately was in Jerusalem. And the reforms, first of all, of Hezekiah and then of Josiah, fulfilled Deuteronomy's prediction, and they did centralize the worship to Jerusalem. The other thing I'd like to talk about is the covenant structure of Deuteronomy, and this is going to suggest a 2nd millennium BC date for the book rather than a 1st millennium BC that the Wellhausen School adopts. There are treaties from the Hittites, and there seems to be similarities between Hittite treaties and the structure of Deuteronomy. This was pointed out by two scholars, George Mendenhall and Meredith Kline, both of whom compared the biblical covenant with the Hittite suzerain treaties. George Mendenhall came first. He argued that God's covenant with Israel is like the treaties made between suzerains, which are monarchs, and their vassals. He was comparing particularly the Hittite treaties with Israel's covenant. This insight was picked up by evangelical scholar Meredith Kline, who observed that parallels with Hittite treaties and the book of Deuteronomy itself can be drawn. In fact, he argued that the structure of the book of Deuteronomy is similar to the structure of the Hittite treaties. Say a word about the Hittites. Hittites were a kingdom that was based around primarily modern-day Turkey, Anatolia. It bled south into Lebanon and Syria. And in the 13th century BC, the Hittites fought with Ramses II for control of the coastal plain of the Mediterranean, which would include the land of Israel. They fought over control of the Levant in the 1200s BC. Well, anyway, this is the way that the Hittite treaties are formulated. The Hittite treaties would begin with a preamble, and then it would have a historical prologue that talked about the historical basis for why they were making a treaty. And then it would give some general stipulations as to what is expected of the vassal to the suzerain. And then it would give some specific stipulations of what the vassal is to do for the suzerain. And then there would be blessings and especially curses if you violate the treaty. There could be a document clause where it would specify that periodically they'd bring out the treaty and read it to remind themselves of what they have obligated themselves to do. And then it has some witnesses to the treaty, particularly divine witnesses, appealing to the gods as witness of the treaty that has been made between the suzerain and the vassal. Now, what Meredith Kline argued is that this structure fits very well the structure of the whole book of Deuteronomy. So you might say that Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 1 through 5 represents a preamble. And then chapter 1, verse 6 through chapter 3:29 gives the history of God's relationship with Israel from patriarchal times until their day. And this would be the historical prologue, like the ones found in the Hittite treaties. And then in Deuteronomy chapters 4 through 11, God gives general stipulations that he expects his people to follow. These include the 10 Commandments in chapter 5 and general exhortations to obey what God has commanded them, like the Shema, Hear, O Israel. But then it would give specific regulations, and a lot of detailed laws are given in chapters 12 through 60, and that goes along with the specific stipulations of the Hittite treaties. Chapters 27 and 28 is the section on blessing and cursing. It gives curses if you disobey the covenant, but promises blessings for obedience. You might say that 27, 1 through 5 is like the document clause in Hittite treaties, where they are to bring out the covenant treaty and to read it periodically. Now, in the place of the divine witnesses of the Hittite treaties, in Deuteronomy 29 through 33, it speaks of heaven and earth as witnesses to the covenant that God made with Israel. And so it doesn't refer to the gods, but heaven and earth, at least symbolically, serve that function. Heaven and earth always being there throughout the generations as witnesses of those events, at least metaphorically. Now, the only part that doesn't parallel the Hittite treaties, according to Kline, is the death of Moses in chapter 34. That's where it ceases to follow the Hittite treaty, Hittite covenant model, and goes off on its own. Now, what are the implications of these parallels? Well, one of the things that it supports is an early date for Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is following the treaty pattern of 2nd millennium BC treaties. Now, it turns out that treaties later on in the 1st millennium no longer follow this specific pattern. And the fact that Deuteronomy follows this pattern of 2nd millennium BC treaties suggests that it is a 2nd millennium BC document rather than a 1st millennium BC document. This in strong contrast with the Wellhausen school. It also gives insight into the relationship between law and covenant. In the analogy, Yahweh is like the great king, the suzerain, and he would be the covenant initiator. Whereas Israel is like the vassals of Hittite treaties. The vassals are subordinate to the great king, the suzerain. And the interesting thing is, if you follow this analogy with the Hittite treaties, laws regulate a covenant after the covenant is established. With the Hittite treaties, it wasn't that the suzerains had to obey the rules, the stipulations, and then there would be a relationship, a treaty relationship. Rather, they establish a treaty relationship first, and once they establish that treaty relationship, then they are obligated to obey the stipulations. And that's the same way it is with the biblical covenant. God first offers Israel a covenant relationship with himself, and only after that's been established are they obligated to keep the law. Keeping the law was not the means of establishing the relationship, it was a result of having established the relationship. Now, this covenant is, again, by grace, not by law. Deuteronomy 7, verses 7 and 8 emphasizes that. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than all other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath that he swore to your ancestors, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh of Egypt. It wasn't because you were so great. It was because God loved you. And it was because God keeps his promises that he swore to your ancestors. It's not that you earned it and deserved it. It was on the basis of grace. Likewise, Deuteronomy 9, 4 through 6 shows it's by grace and not law, in that they actually didn't deserve it. It says, after the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you are going to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Understand then that it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stiff-necked people. He says emphatically over and over again, it's not because of your righteousness. It's not because of your righteousness. It's not because of your righteousness. In fact, you're not that righteous at all. You're a stiff-necked people. But God, by grace, offered them a relationship and the benefits of that relationship, the land promise. So that's the end of our first lecture. And in our next lecture, we'll go through the sections of Deuteronomy that we described in the Hittite Treaty passage, and we will say some things about each section.